Good evening, this is Brown at Eye of Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about The House of Knight and Chain, a Warhammer horror novel by David Annandale. Now, Warhammer is a gaming franchise that has been around for a couple of decades now, and it started off as a fantasy-based war game. And then a little bit later, the people who made the game decided to try and make a more science fiction based version of it. And so, regardless of whether it's fantasy or science fiction, not only do you have a lot of overlapping elements, but you also have a pervasive atmosphere of cynicism, hopelessness, and just full-on, darkness. And it's a setting in which it's fascinating to read about, especially if you're, say, a fan of fantasy or science fiction or horror. Warhammer 40K is a setting that basically brings all these elements together, and it makes for a fascinating world to read about. But it's definitely not a setting that, regardless of how much you like reading, the books in the series in the franchise, it's not a setting you yourself would want to live in. I mean, it's just a nightmare. And say, unlike Star Wars or Star Trek, which, I mean, there might be some grim events that take place in those settings at times, there is still an element of hope that people can rely on, to relate to the characters. And you get the feeling that in Star Trek and Star Wars, I mean, yeah, there might be a body count, but at the same time, the heroes are going to survive. They will get through the day, for the most part. But with Warhammer 40K, as well as just the original Warhammer series in general, it's not like that. I mean, hope is in very short supply, and you wouldn't want to find yourself in that world. Just basically think of the atmosphere of Game of Thrones, if you want an idea of just how cynical it is. I mean, there's like a lot of gray area. Even though there are good guys and bad guys, there are times where you can feel sympathy for both sides. But at the same time, even when, say, someone's right, they're wrong about it in some way or another. Anyway, though, so they recently started putting out a series of horror novels, both for the fantasy setting as well as the science fiction setting. And the House of Knight and Chain is in the science fiction setting of Warhammer, namely Warhammer 40K. And one of the things I appreciate about this novel is that while it does take place in a setting which has so much lore attached to it, you can actually pick this book up and basically read it as a perfectly functional standalone horror novel that just happens to take place in the setting of Warhammer 40K. And if you've never read anything in the Warhammer 40K setting, this wouldn't be a bad introduction to the franchise, especially if you just want a good quick horror story. And I liked it. because while there are elements in this book where, if you've read anything else from the Warhammer 40K setting, you can definitely pick up on certain things, like maybe certain events that happened in the past of one of the characters, or certain types of military jargon. So basically, you're reading a Warhammer 40K novel, but at the same time, though, they go out of their way to, basically put you in a haunted house story that just happens to be in the setting of Warhammer 40K. And so it tells a story of a guy named Mason Strock, who is a colonel in the Astra Militarum, and that's one of the many divisions within the human military, and he has basically devoted his life to war, but he does have a family to come home to eventually. And after one of his most recent skirmishes, or battles, if you will, in which he lost an arm and has a mechanical arm in place of it now, he is sort of promoted upstairs, if you will, in the sense that, he's given a position of authority, but it's a position that doesn't allow him to serve in the military anymore. It doesn't allow him to fight, but instead he's given the task of being the planetary governor of this world that's ripe with corruption. And it's also a world that he has ties to, in the sense that there's a mansion there that has a history, with his family, and it's supposedly there's a lot of stories going around about it, about how there's a lot of pain and death involved at the place, but it's hard to tell how much of it is hearsay and how much is for real. But he accepts the post of this position, and in doing so, he also looks up his family, which is namely his two now adult children who live on this world, but as his son and his daughter, but who are both very different people. The son, he's in a position on the planetary council, but he uses that position to basically just kind of pitter around and waste time and party all night long, without any sort of serious repercussions. His daughter, on the other hand, is in the military, and she's basically she has basically a rank of leadership in her position, and she's a very cold, hostile individual, but not without reason. Namely, their mother, Mason's wife, apparently committed suicide several years ago, when she herself was given the status of planetary governor, while Mason was off and fighting in wars. And for whatever reason, she ended up committing suicide, and supposedly. And so his children are understandably upset with their father for not being there, not only for the mother but for them as well. And so Mason, he comes to this world, and he's got a lot on his plate. And he's coming home to live in an ancestral mansion that has a lot of dark history behind it. But he also, he's struggling with PTSD from multiple combat experiences. The most recent of which is what cost him his arm. But he's also, struggling with, longing to, re-embrace, his family, or his surviving family, rather, as well as, guilt for not being there for his wife. Because, this guy, he values duty above all else, but at the same time, he's realizing just how much it's cost him. And so, but he also, he realizes that he's been given a task to, run this planet, and also to deal with the corruption on the planetary council. And there's a lot of enemies that, are, some of them are hiding in plain sight. Some of them are, very blatant and obvious. But it's all sorts of, political intrigue. But he finds, though, that, the horror, that is all pervasive in this galaxy has, come home to his doorstep. And, the stories about, his mansion, the mansion he's in, Annandale, there's a lot more to it than just rumors. There actually is something going on there that, drives, the previous tenants, if you will, the previous owners of the mansion, into tragedy. And, Mason, he wants to give hope to this world, and he wants to, do his duty, and he wants to, restore, relationship with his family. But this mansion, though, the darkness within, it's not going to let him. And I would say more, but I don't want to give away, too much in terms of, spoilers. But suffice to say that this being the setting of Warhammer 40k, there's a lot of overlapping between, psychological horror, as well as supernatural horror. And I like that. I liked how you have the horror that comes with, PTSD, as well as, the tragedy of not having been there for one's family when they needed you the most, but then also the supernatural horror that is definitely a part of this setting. And it, combines together to make, a rather good old-fashioned, haunted house story. And a lot of there were several moments where, you're reading, where the point of view of the story, it often goes back and forth between the perspective of the main character, as well as his late wife, because it turns out she'd actually kept a journal during her days at this mansion. And when you're reading from her perspective, it's actually pretty spooky, because you see how she's gradually deteriorating in terms of her, psychological well-being. And the way it's written is, if you didn't know you were in a Warhammer 40K setting, I mean, you would think that she's honestly going mad. But as the main character, as Mason comes to find, it's not just madness. I mean, there is something at this mansion that's toying with him and his family. And, and so a lot of what his wife is experiencing and was writing down about, and with her experiences in her journals, starts to happen with him too. And so it's interesting reading about the perspectives of two different people going through almost the exact same thing. And it also, I also appreciated how the horror is very ambiguous in this particular book. I mean, yes, that the mansion, Melville, it's haunted, for lack of a better term. But at the same time, though, while there is an effort made to try and reconstruct, the source of the events leading up to the source of the horror, and you get to that point, you find out, okay, what's causing the horror. You do find out exactly when it started, because multiple characters do some forms of detective work, and they eventually do make a rather chilling discovery. But at the same time, though, there's just enough left unsaid to where, okay, that this happened, but at the same time, you don't know, other than, say, one party, you don't know who or what the other forces are exactly. And so you have a case of, of a character eventually coming to realize why he and his family have been haunted all these years, or decades, if you will. But at the same time, though, he's in a position where he's helpless because he doesn't know what it is exactly that he's going up against. And also at the same time, he the house, much like other haunted house novels, all across the board, the evil that's in the house, it feeds off of him more or less, and makes him its toy. It controls him almost, in a sense that even if he knows that leaving the house, getting outside, would do wonders for his well-being, he can't bring himself to do it unless it wants him to. And the hallucinations, or supposed hallucinations, that he experiences, they almost start to become just a part of everyday life over there. I mean, regardless of how horrific these visions are that he starts to see, it's almost like he starts to get used to it, much like his wife did before she may or may not have committed suicide. And horror goes hand in hand with him at this point, and it's almost like he just comes to accept it. And people outside of the house, they some of them catch on that there's something wrong, but whether it's the house's own doing or Mason's own doing, either way, the help that he so desperately needs, it very seldom finds its way to him, regardless of his position as planetary governor. I mean, this is, a force, or these are forces in which, societal rank mean less than nothing. We're all, just flesh and scum and playthings for, these dark forces. And so, and so it was, I guess you could say, a haunted house novel with, a good dose of cosmic horror, just in the sense of realize how minuscule you are, in the grand scheme of things, at least when you're reading it from the character's perspective, they realize just how minuscule they are in the grand scheme of things. And in regards to not only this house, but these forces in the universe that just, they can't see, or that supposedly don't exist, but quite clearly do. At least, according to, the their ruling bodies, according to, the people pulling the strings in society, you know, demonic forces don't exist. But when you're in a situation where you're clearly being plagued by demonic forces, you know, what your society is saying, it doesn't really, hold water when you're going through hell. And that's exactly what's going on with Mason's character. Um, and yeah, so this was actually a pretty good horror novel. And it was a good standalone horror novel too, which I appreciated because, when I got this, I mean, I knew because it was in a Warhammer setting, there would be connections to, you know, people or events that I'd read about in, say, other books. And that was the case, but not to the point of, say, you would have to have read, 10 other books just to read this standalone horror novel. No, it was more like the elements that would pop up that had been featured in other works. It's kind of serves as a um, spot of familiarity. You see it and you're like, okay, yeah, you're definitely in a Warhammer setting. But other than that, though, I mean, this story, stood well on its own, and it was a good horror story, and sometimes, that's all one needs is a good story that's, by itself, even though it's in a setting that has multiple stories to tell. And uh, yeah, and I definitely look forward to reading, others, standalone horror stories, uh, be it in, the fantasy setting or the science fiction setting. And so if you're looking for a good horror story or a good standalone Warhammer story, The House of Knight and Chain, uh, it's definitely worth picking up. Um, I would, I'm thinking that I will give The House of Knight and Chain 4 out of 5 stars, because it did while there was a lot of familiarity to the proceedings. If you've read, you know, any horror novel in your life, you're going to pick up on a few things. Sort of I'm not going to say been there, done that, but you're going to have some deja vu moments. But because it's in the setting that it's in, the horror, while it does, have some familiar moments, i.e. the um, diary of a deceased loved one, giving the protagonist clues on, a supernatural, threat that's menacing them in the present. I mean, something like that. Because this is the setting of Warhammer, it it makes it stand out more, just because of the type of horror that the main character ends up dealing with. And so, even though it feels familiar at times, it still manages to be unique because of the setting that it takes place in. And so, yeah, uh, House of Night Chain, 4 out of 5 stars. It was a good horror novel, and like I said, I look forward to reading more horror novels within the setting to come. And thank you very much for taking the time to check out this review. You got any questions? Drop a line. Let me know. Y'all have a good night.